very good run of it tonight. We had the analysis of Friends in High Places by Alan, looking at the powerful, if you like, allies which Ulster Unionism commanded in the British Tory establishment, in the British press, in the aristocracy, even in court circles in that critical period. And of course, the support of Bonar Law and the British Conservative Party. It was Bonar Law who said, of course, that there are things stronger than parliamentary majorities in reference to opposing Home Rule. And Gordon has given his very, very insightful analysis of the document and what it represented. And we've learned something of the emotions of the occasion, but also of that minority of Ulster Protestants who were there really from the days of the former Orangeman Isaac Butt, and who rejected opposition to Home Rule and regarded Home Rule as the cementing of the bonds between the two islands, ensuring that Ireland remained in the empire. Maybe we have a first question.
I was surprised to read that very early on in the debate on the Home Rule bill in Parliament, one of the Liberal deputies called Agar O'Bartes put forward the suggestion that, or an amendment, I'm not sure which, that the solution to the problem might lie in granting 4 counties,
yes,
a 4-county unit. And what baffles me listening, I know this is slightly at a tangent to what you've been speaking about, but what baffles me throughout this whole period is the complete, on all sides, blindness to the fact that there were 2 entities on this island. Redmond particularly seeing partition as an abomination. But Carson, Craig, and even the people you spoke about yourself, the Protestant Home Rulers, never seemed to countenance the idea that something would have to be done. And it struck me in the context of what was the terrible history of Ireland up to the Good Friday Agreement, if Agar O'Barty's suggestion of 4 counties, you would have had 2 very boring but homogeneous communities in Ireland, a Catholic one and a Protestant one. And perhaps we might have spared some of the terrible killings of the Troubles which followed on partition. Which, just finally, I'm amazed that the people keep referring, the Unionists kept referring to Ulster all the time without spelling out what they meant by Ulster. Were they that blind, or was it tactical that they didn't realise we're not going? There's no point in fighting for an Ulster of 9 counties. You're going to create more trouble. If you take, if you take anything less, but contains significant Catholic majority, you're creating trouble.
The first one is basically about the possibility of a compromise early on, avoiding conflict, and how realistic was the 9-county claim. And I'll put that to both of you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 9. I mean, it was interesting. You mentioned Agar Robards. He was MP for St Austell in Cornwall, and he came from a very strong non-conformist area, and many of his. I expect he reflected the fears of many of his constituents to Irish Home Rule. I take your point. I think a lot of people actually thought, a lot of the Unionist strategists felt that if they held out for 9 counties, that it would scupper the whole Home Rule measure. So, I mean, they realised the demographics, that in the 9 counties there were more Catholics, therefore probably more nationalists than Unionists. But they also thought that if they held out for that, for the 9 counties, and this was the initial thinking that they would do that, that the whole measure would be scuppered. I mean, Carson and others, of course, started to realise, and Bonar Law and others later on, that would not be necessarily, that would not actually work, and there was some compromise on it. But that I mean, it's one of those questions. If you rewrite history, if you think one of those moments, what would have happened, and you're quite right. It's a fascinating alternative. I think you mentioned there.
Well, first of all, Lloyd George and Winston Churchill were both of the view at a very, very early stage that Home Rule for the whole of Ireland was not on, and that you would have to have some form of Ulster exclusion. So I always find the idea of Churchill coming over here to sing the praises of Home Rule, a measure, incidentally, which he had really very little belief or confidence in. He crossed the floor of the House of Commons in 1904 over the question of tariff reform, and he never entirely was a convinced Home Ruler. And I find it interesting that Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, two of the sharpest members of the cabinet, realised it wasn't a goer. But Asquith could not contemplate at this early stage any compromise whatsoever, because it would antagonise and alienate his Home Rule support in the House of Commons. The other point I suppose that one would want to make is that Carson was an Irish Unionist. Carson took on board the leadership of the Irish Unionist Parliamentary Party in order to frustrate Home Rule for the whole of Ireland. He wasn't interested in just saving Ulster. He loathed and despised the idea of Home Rule. He genuinely believed that it would be bad for Ireland. He believed passionately in the Union. He believed passionately in Pitt's case made for the Union in the House of Commons in 1799. So Carson was a committed Unionist, and he wanted to destroy Home Rule for the whole of Ireland. Carson believed that Ulster was the vehicle which would enable him to achieve this, for two reasons. First of all, he took the view that Home Rule would not be viable without Belfast's heavy industry and the industry of the surrounding area. He thought it would be simply unviable. In that he was incorrect. He also thought that Redmond and Irish nationalist opinion would not accept Home Rule with Ulster exclusion. Therefore, if you could demonstrate that Ulster Unionists were resolute in their opposition to Home Rule, and they would not tolerate Home Rule or wear it, then the Home Rule project would simply die. So this idea of talking about 4 counties, 6 counties in 1912 is largely an irrelevance. Now, Carson understood the significance of the Agar-Roberts Amendment. He himself, in January 1913, proposed 9-county exclusion, but that was essentially a tactic to destroy the unity of the forces that were arrayed against him. Carson himself thought that he could actually defeat Home Rule for the whole of Ireland by using Ulster opposition. Up until some period between the summer of 1913 and the autumn of 1913, Carson addressed 2 rallies, a rally in Monaghan, in New Bliss, in August 1913, and you can detect a level of optimism. At least I feel there's a level of optimism and a belief that he can still do it. And then in the beginning of October 1913, he talks at Rafo, and I detect less optimism. Something is changing, and he does have a conversation with Southern Irish Unionists in which he asks them a series of questions. And the questions really are, if I can't save the whole of Ireland for the Union, but can save Ulster for the Union, or part of Ulster for the Union, are you happy with that? Will you allow me to do that? And they allowed him to do that. They indicated a willingness for him to do that. So that's what the role of Ulster. It's not really whether it's 4 counties, 9 counties. Incidentally, Ulster, according to the 1911 census, was 57% Protestant.
That's right.
For what that's
yes,
worth.
it's 43-40. Yes, I would agree with all of that. Asquith's strategy in 1912 was to give Redmond his sort of kind of reduced demand of all Ireland Home Rule with a view to making compromises later on. If the going got rough on the Ulster question, then concessions could be made at a later stage. He's criticised by historians like Patricia Gilland for that, the view being that had the concessions come early on, had there been a will to compromise, then you could have had a 4-county split, what Agar-Roberts was proposing. He was killed in the First World War, actually, a Liberal MP, but he was proposing that. He said that Irish whiskey and orange bitters didn't mix. You remember that famous June 1912 speech? Had Redmond gone for that then, before the dreary steeples began to cast their long shadows across the northern landscape, it's more than likely that, a Protestant heartland centred on the heartland of the plantation, northeast Ulster, would have been cut off from the rest of Ireland, probably without violence and a much softer line on the map. You know, if you think about it, you go from Carlisle into Scotland, you know, today, well, perhaps not for very much longer, and it's a soft line on the map. But the border that emerged out of the bloodshed and violence and kind of civil war of the early 1920s, north and south, became a real line on the map with a Cold War persisting across it for another 50 years. There was that aspect. So I think an opportunity was probably lost there. David Trimble makes this point in the 1990s. He said he thought a four-county split before the big house became involved in the debate, saying that they paid the rates in Fermanagh and Tyrone, which had clear but small nationalist majorities. Carson, the Irish Unionist, is also very important. I mean, Carson set out to use Ulster as a weapon. I mean, it was never a cause for Carson. It was a cause for Craig. You know, the East Ulster man with his finger very much on the orange pulse, reflecting the kind of entrepreneurial skill of the Lagan Valley. But for Carson, Ulster was the weapon, he said, initially, 1912-13, which would kill Home Rule stone dead, which would force Redmond to recoil, really. The threat of partition would ward off nationalist demands for Home Rule. That clearly was not going to happen. And by 1913, as I think J.C. Beckett puts it, Carson becomes the prisoner of Ulster Unionists. Increasingly, he's actually canvassing for a compromise in private. He's seeking the best deal for his clients, his northern clients, which is surfaced by the Buckingham Palace Conference. It hardens in 1916 in the failed Lloyd George negotiations. And of course, this leaves Carson bereft after 1916 because he has failed to save what he calls consistently my own people. I mean, remember, his mother's people were big house people, Castle Lambert, County Galway. He went to school at Port Arlington, now County Laois. He was Trinity College, the son of an architect, and therefore he was a Southerner in every sense of the word. And that actually surges forth in the anger of the treaty debates in the House of Lords in 1921, when faced with a virtually independent Ireland, signed over by his friends to Michael Collins. What does he say? What a fool I was. And so was Ulster, and so was Ireland, in the game that was to get the Conservative Party into power. You have that sense of kind of misgiving, of having abandoned his own people. And in that sense, you could say, the statue at Stormont is a tombstone to Carson's failure, rather than a monument to his political success.
Eamon, can I just come back on the nine-county thing which Gordon referred to? I think I'm right in saying that, I won't go over the demographic figures, but I think I'm right in saying that there was, in the 9 counties, a majority of one and far as nationalists over unionist representation in Parliament was concerned. I think that's and that may well have been part of the loyalist mindset, that when they thought, you know, we have to be careful here in a 9-county province. We if you look at the figures at the time, I think the seat up in Derry, in Londonderry, was won by a Home Ruler, Hogg, was it, in 1913.
Well, you know the old story about winning a seat by 16 votes. Stuart Devlin supporters coming out of the poll in West Belfast, and Maggie says to Minnie, wouldn't you love to have been one of those 13 voters, 16 voters? And she says, sure, Maggie, I was all 16. Situation in those days. But the key thing is that it was actually Craig and the Ulster Unionists who reject 9 counties, because the 1920 Act, as you know, formulated by the Long Committee, remember that was a coalition government after the First World War, it proposed a 9-county Northern Ireland. Now, there was never any problem about that, except if you had a parliament relying on local votes with maybe a very narrow unionist majority. And it was James Craig, a junior minister in 1919, who intervened and said 6 counties would be more homogeneous and more easily defended. The Anglo-Irish War was affecting large parts of rural Ulster at that time, places like Donegal, and he thought they were ungovernable. So there's a sense of the broken covenant. Those 80,000 loyalists in the 3 lost counties, even the language tells us about that sense of abandonment by especially the Protestants of North Monaghan and East Donegal. There would be a sense of having been abandoned by the Ulster Unionist Council, but it was pragmatism.